I definitely regret getting overly enthusiastic about Calvin Ridley in fantasy football. You were definitely a little more wise about this than I was.
So I take a look at it, right, and I'm saying to myself, all right, Calvin Ridley, I don't think had a very good season. But when I look at the RP profile, Matt, this guy was green on nearly every single route this past year.
Look at the release.
There's your separation.
Great route.
Stutter and go. Gets by clean.
That is unbelievable.
Maybe the greatest catch I've ever seen.
Calvin Ridley, I think, especially in fantasy football, really one of the true busts of the 2023 fantasy football. Again, fantasy football campaign. I just want to highlight that, okay? One of the most inconsistent week-to-week players last year. I think of that there's absolutely no doubt, but did finish the season 76 catches on 136 targets, cracked 1,000 yards, had a very productive 8 touchdowns on the season overall. Again, averaged about 60 yards per game, but week to week, Matt, he was just about as inconsistent as it comes, and a career low 55.9% catch rate. The efficiency metrics just weren't there for Calvin Ridley in 2023.
Yeah, it's funny, and I know I've made this point in the show before that first thing I wrote in the profile that I definitely regret getting overly enthusiastic about Calvin Ridley in fantasy football. You were definitely a little more wise about this than I was. I will say though, it's just funny, just like yeah, he's considered this bust from a production standpoint. It was the overdrawn expectations and the week to week volatility, both of which we'll address with some of the RP data here in this profile. But also, like, I just maintain it's kind of funny that like when the Jags made this trade for Calvin Ridley at the deadline last year, you know, this kind of unique trade with all these different draft pick stipulations and all that, and playing time stipulations and future contract stipulations. If you had told the Jaguars or anybody at that time, yeah, in 2023, he's going to catch 76 passes for over 1,000 yards and catch 8 touchdowns, people probably been like, wow, great trade.
Score.
Like, that actually worked out. Yeah,
yep.
that worked really well. We'll take that. The overall takeaway, James, for me from his profile was that this was a in terms of the volatility and, you know, some of the issues week to week for him, it was some of it's on Ridley, you know, because I think fantasy folks are like, well, F Calvin Ridley, he stinks, all that stuff. You know, but he definitely was a little bit worse than anticipated, but he was still a darn good player. And some of the other factors involved here are a big thing of why he was so volatile week to week.
Okay, so I take a look at it, right, and I'm saying to myself, all right, Calvin Ridley, I don't think had a very good season. But when I look at the RP profile, Matt, this guy was green on nearly every single route this past year. And again, when you go to the website, receptionperception.com, green is good. Okay, that means he was above league average on nearly every single route. The only route that he was below league average on was the curl. But again, I think a lot of people are going to be very surprised by that.
Yeah, by the way, curl routes, running a lot of curl routes, 18.9%. That was tied with the 9 route in terms of his most commonly run route. But you're right, Ridley's still a really good route runner and a really high-quality separator. 71.9% success rate versus man coverage. That's 69th percentile. That's a pretty good number. We like any outside receiver that's going to be over 70%. It is worth noting, though, while that's a good number, it is not well below, but pretty decently below his career expectations, where in his first 4 seasons of his career, we're talking about a guy that was 76.2%, 77.6%, 76%, and 76.4% success rate versus man coverage. So a little tick down in his first year back from a year and a half away from football. Now, where there was a real drop off was against press coverage. And this was a clear issue throughout the course of the season, just watching him, like even yards per route run against press coverage, targets per route run against press coverage. Those numbers actually were in line with the RP data here, which isn't always the case, but it was in line with the RP data here, where the first 4 years of his career, Calvin Ridley with the Atlanta Falcons, 78.6% success rate versus press, 77.6%, 75.6%, and 75%.
Okay.
Here with the Jacksonville Jaguars, he falls down to 66.7%, which is it's like fine. It's a little bit below average, but it's a big drop off for him, like a 10% drop off for him. That was the one thing that I think, if we're looking at Calvin Ridley from an individual standpoint, we'll talk about the usage of deployment here and where the Jaguars are at fault in just a second. But rounding out the Ridley part of this, where he was clearly a lesser version of himself, was against press coverage, working physical off the line of scrimmage. The technique stuff is still generally there, but I think he was just a little less explosive off the line, a little easier to beat around from physical corners. And maybe that's, again, part of being away from a year, part of just being, a year and a half older than where he was. You got to remember, this is also a guy who came into the league pretty older too. He was an older prospect, sneaky old, as we like to say. So that could maybe just be a part of it for Ridley too.
Okay.
The Jags coaching staff last year just didn't do a lot to work around those issues, man. It was striking, at least when you roll out the profile.
What could the Jags have done? Should they have put him in motion a little bit more? Should they? Because again, the Jags offense is pretty static. They had Ridley lining up outside and basically asking him to win one-on-one a lot of times. And as we saw, Matt wasn't winning one-on-one all that often. So I don't know, man. What could the Jags have done?
Yeah, so here's the Jaguars part of this and where they did not do Ridley any favors. I mean, this is a guy who lined up almost exclusively, static is the way to say it, lined up almost exclusively as an X receiver. And like prior to this season, I would have said, prior to him leaving the NFL, I'm like, yeah, he has the ability to beat press man coverage like an X receiver. But clearly, again, that was an issue throughout the season. They should have adjusted that. They did a little bit better job at the back half of the season moving him around. But again, this guy, just look at his alignment data from this past season with Jacksonville. 78.8% success rate, 78.8% of his sample snaps were outside. He was on the line. He was on the line for 79% of his snaps, and he was outside 81.8%. That is almost exclusively X receiver stuff. We're talking about a guy that was like 50-50 from 2020 to 2018, 50-50 kind of between X and flanker. That probably would have been better usage for him, because here's the real problem where this comes into it. You look at the route tree that Ridley was assigned as that X receiver, which by the way, he still got double coverage on 13.6% of his routes. Like that's it's not an extremely high amount, but it's a pretty high amount for a number one receiver. Like teams wanted to take away Calvin Ridley. They did dedicate extra resources to do that. And the route tree made it even easier on top of the alignment. 48.6% of Ridley's sampled routes were a 9, a curl, or a comeback. Like we're talking about being tethered to the line, no motion, and just working the boundary. Like you're either running down the field or you're coming back to the quarterback. And Ridley's good on those below expectations this year, no doubt about it, but he's generally good on like comeback routes and generally pretty good running 9 routes. But it just makes it harder. It invites higher degree of difficulty throws. Like the best way I can say it is that the Jaguars took a route running specialist in Calvin Ridley and gave him like our favorite receiver, Devontae Parker's role or Mike Williams' role or like George Pickens' role. And that just didn't make a lot of sense to me.
Less than 10% of his routes were slant routes, which I think that doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense.
That's wild.
First of all, I mean, if you're playing the X receiver spot, that to me doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? Like you either want to be able to test these guys vertically, but if they're giving you too much space, man, like you got to be able to have something in the bag where you're like, all right, cool, quick slant route inside, right? Less than 10% slant route percentage for Calvin Ridley. That's insanity to me. I have a question in regards to, the curl route, because he's green, which means he's above average everywhere else. He's below league average on the curl route. And when you look at his historical data, Matt, huge drop off. I mean, his first 3 years in the league, somewhere in that 85% success rate range in the curl. And in 2023, we're looking at 72% success rate. That's a big time drop off. Again, kind of sort of visually from the film perspective, what are we looking at there?
Well, the curl route's a man beater. Like that's a man beater route. You're going to want to Like, especially for these outside receivers like Calvin Ridley, who still, like, he shouldn't be a slot, okay? Like, that's Christian Kirk's role. Like, he should still be an outside receiver, but probably as that Z. Probably, it could be more 60-40 ZX. Like, that's probably the best usage for Ridley to invite some of those higher degree, those high percentage throws is really what you're looking for with Ridley. So, like, think about, like, a guy like Ridley, like you're push. You're pushing vertically. You're pushing down the field, and then you're coming back to the quarterback. Like, that's a man coverage beating route. And that was clearly where, or press coverage beating route. And that was really where Ridley struggled this year. I think some of it's a timing issue. Lawrence and Ridley talked a lot about how they were desperately trying to work on their chemistry. And there were times where it looked incredible. I mean, curl route specifically, dude, Calvin Ridley tore up the Colts on these curl routes and like these go routes and stuff like that in week 1. Like, it looked like right away they had great chemistry. At other times, the timing wasn't great. Also, by the way, like, even beyond just, hey, where is Ridley lining up? How are we deploying Ridley? There were other issues in Jacksonville's offense from a pass protection standpoint that's throwing off the timing of these plays that I think made it harder for Lawrence and Ridley to get on the same page. But so that's kind of just where I would say that drop off was, again, just it goes back to the man press coverage stuff where we saw a drop off with him as a player.